Section 1.3 provides an example of scientific inquiry by examining Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. Here we have an example of how a scientist develops a hypothesis and a theory, and how a theory gains acceptance. Charles Darwin, he served as a naturalist on a mapping expedition around coastal South America. He compiled 30 years worth of observations and study before publishing his book that changed scientific thinking about life here on Earth. It was called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Here is, this is an older picture of him later in life when he traveled on the HMS Beagle, which was the expedition ship to help map out South America. And this map shows his route. He was younger at the time. There's a lot of interesting history behind that, but to save time, we won't go into that. I do encourage you to look that up because it's fascinating. Because he started out medical school and then went to seminary school and then ended up as a naturalist here on the Beagle, the HMS Beagle. So one of the key things here is that other people had thought that life on this planet had changed over time. But what the difference here was that Charles Darwin provided a mechanism for how that change occurred, and that's when this idea actually became a science. Because when you provide a mechanism, which he called natural selection, now you can actually test that mechanism. So it provides a model for testing, which fits with the process of science. Darwin observed differences as he's traveled around all those places. He observed differences in related organisms. He saw that characteristics of similar species varied from one place to another. One of the places he stopped at was the Galapagos Islands, which were off the coast of Ecuador. He observed 14 different species of finches. They were all similar, but they did have differences in their slight differences in their appearance, especially with their beaks and how they fed and their habits, their food habits. Overall, he thought that perhaps these finches had come about from an ancestor finch that migrated to that island, and then over time slowly went through changes. And he called these changes descent with modification. As an example, I provide this diagram here that I found elsewhere other than your textbook, but gives the kind of idea. Up here on the top is this axis up here is in millions of years ago. So we start about 55 million years ago, and we have here this little fork in this diagram here that represents right at this location common ancestor to these organisms. Now, the pictures here that don't make it all the way to the end are of organisms that went extinct. So this organism and this one, these are all actually mammals here. They all went extinct at some point back in time. But as you follow this chart here, and these represent fossils that have been found in these dated rocks going back tens of millions of years. At every place here that we have a branching would represent a common ancestor, and then over time, changes that occurred to develop new groups of organisms here. So what we have here are these descriptions of what these common ancestors might have had here. For example, I'll just highlight one, and then we're going to move on here. Here was a nasal opening started to shift back between the eyes. You know how the whales and dolphins have a blowhole up on top of their head, which is kind of like our nostrils for breathing. So that began to occur, and you started to see that shift going with those fossils. So today we do have toothed whales, and we have the baleen whales, and they're still alive today. And if you go back far enough, you find a common ancestor between the hippopotamus and modern whales. Then I also included over here another bit of interesting item that we see in organisms today, these what we call vestigial structures, which are structures that we see in living things today of of anatomical structures that are no longer used. For example, whales. If you watch the progression here, you see that in these fossils, you start to see the hind limbs becoming smaller and smaller, and eventually, right here, they're hardly existent there, and eventually they disappear. However, modern whales still have the hip bone and parts of the leg bone. They're just hidden within there. And so that's pretty interesting. So these basically show evidence of structures that once had a function in ancestors but no longer do today. And then here we have snakes. Some of the snakes, like boas and boa constrictors and pythons, also still have right in this area here. They still have basically parts of what would be the hip bone, as well as what would have been the leg, with these little spurs that stick out. So here's those. This is those spurs right there. From the outside, you can still see them. So it's rather interesting. Darwin also read a book by Thomas Malthus concerning populations, and in there, Malthus had described or written down what had been understood, and that populations of plants and animals seem to increase geometrically. Another way of saying that is exponentially. So if you look at a graph, and here you have time, and here you have the number of individuals in a population over time, you're going to get this J-shaped increase of the number of individuals in that population as the population begins to multiply. He also noticed that for humans, as humans are concerned, they do have the potential to grow like that, but they did not have the ability to increase their food supply. Instead, humans increase their food supply arithmetically. Arithmetically is just a different way of saying linearly, so instead the food supply would grow like that. So it was thought then that just like animals in nature, humans could also perhaps exceed the ability to grow enough food to support the growing populations. So this was basically an explanation as to why populations in nature seem to remain at a constant size, because the death limits the population numbers, and the death is because there may not be enough resources such as food to feed all of the individuals in that population. So essentially, more offspring are produced than do survive. So that's kind of a key into part of Darwin's natural selection mechanism. This is just a graph showing comparing the progression of geometric and linear growth. So you can see in geometric growth, numbers can go a lot faster, faster and faster and faster. So they also call that exponential growth. So what is the evidence then for natural selection that Darwin talked about? Well, one of the first ones there is the fossil record. And the fossil record, just like showed you the diagram below before with the whales, many transition fossils have been found. And they've been found at times that would be predicted by the theory. And I'll show you a picture of one that I included. It's not in your textbook. It's rather interesting. But the other key here to Darwin's theory was time and Earth's age. And in order for these ideas to kind of make more sense, the Earth would have to be a lot older than they thought it was back in those days. So it was thought, actually, that many people thought that the Earth was thousands of years old, and then physicists started doing calculations based on hot molten rock and their knowledge of how heat is transferred or thermodynamics, and so they gave estimate in the millions based on those types of measurements and calculations. But even they were wrong. It took the discovery of radioisotopes to actually date some of the oldest rocks, and we now know today that the evidence strongly suggests that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. So that's way older, 1,000 times greater than what was originally thought. And I mentioned transition fossils earlier. This particular transition fossil right here, Tiktaalik, was found in about 2006, and this is rather interesting because there's always a lot of debate. Well, you don't have enough transition fossils to support the theory, but as time progresses, we keep finding more and more transition fossils. This Tiktaalik, the actual fossil is right here, or one of them. They found 10 fossils, perhaps more by now. But the interesting thing is they were digging up in Canada, in Canadian areas. So here, down here is the Midwestern United States, and then up here in Canada, further up north, there was an outcropping of rocks that were about the age that would predict a missing link between lobe-finned fish, and these are fish that have actual bones. Most modern fish today don't have these bones in their fins, but these do. They have bones that are thought to later become what would be our forelimbs and hind limbs in vertebrates that walk on land. But this particular fossil is found about 385 million years ago, and then Ichthyostega right up here was found about 365 million years ago. So there should be a fossil that shows a progression or characteristics in between those two individuals. And sure enough, in rocks that were around 375 million years ago in Canada, they actually discovered this. So there, the discovery of that fossil fit with the prediction. So there's the element of what makes this science, is that the theory can predict this, and then you go out and you look and you observe and you find evidence that actually fits with that prediction. Other evidence for this, and this is not known at the time. At the time, people generally agreed that the offspring from plants and animals tended to look like their parents, but they didn't know the exact mechanism of how inheritance occurred. That wasn't discovered until later, and it turns out that when we get to genetics, we'll study this, but Mendel's laws of inheritance actually support this theory. So again, a different area of study, a different line of evidence that actually comes back and supports this theory of evolution. Another bit of evidence is comparative anatomy. If we compare vertebrates, these are animals that have backbones like fish and birds and humans and dogs and whales, all these animals that have backbones, and you look at their forelimbs, which are like our arms, they're going to have the same basic types of bones. And I'm going to show a picture of that in a while, but the basic idea here is that with time, these bones have become modified to suit different functions. For example, for whales, for being able to swim, or bats, which are mammals and vertebrates, their forelimbs have been modified for flight, and same for birds and so on. Now, these bones or these structures, they do have this similar origin. If you go back far enough, you find an ancestor that had these structures. They're going to be called homologous structures, and homo means same. So here we're talking about the same evolutionary origin, but the structures may have different function. And this should be considered alongside with analogous structures, which are not the same thing. So just bring that up here. These are going to be structures that have a different evolutionary origin, but used for the same purpose. An example is the butterfly wing and the bird wings. The bird wings, their bones in there are more like our bones and are shared from an ancestor if you go back far enough, but the butterfly wings don't even have those bones inside their wings. They have wings for flying, which is similar to birds, but they don't have the same ancestry. So here's a picture of the bones of some vertebrates, including humans, cats, bats, porpoise, which is like a dolphin, and a horse. And similar bones are colored similarly. So there's the humerus. All the humerus bones are colored white, and then bones of the forearm, the radius, and the ulna. In some cases, those bones have fused together or become shortened, like in the porpoise there. And then the digits, or the fingers, you can see how they've become modified, real awkward, like looking, like in the bat there, and in the porpoise, and in the horse. It seems as these bones have fused together. But they all do have that same origin, so they're considered homologous structures. Then there's the molecular evidence, so more modern techniques of studying proteins in DNA have allowed for comparison with these organisms among organisms. So we can compare organisms that look quite similar and compare with organisms that look way different, and see that as you get to organisms that look more and more different, the differences in those molecules become greater and greater. And so they did that here with this chart here, and they developed a relationship between some of these vertebrates here, from frogs, birds, dogs, the rhesus monkey, which is a primate, which is the same group humans belong to. And they're looking at molecule of hemoglobin, which is a protein that carries blood. Found in the blood that carries oxygen. And our genes are what code for these proteins. Our DNA prescribes or is responsible for making this hemoglobin. So if you go through time and that DNA changes slightly over time, then you'd expect to see more and more differences the further back you go. So if we put this scale here, we could call that time. And you go back in time here, again we have that branching like I showed you earlier. Those would be common ancestors, and you're going back further and further in time. But you also show, this chart also shows the difference in the number of amino acids that occur between the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that's made of amino acids, and the key is how different is that hemoglobin depends on how different the amino acids are. And so the difference between human and a rhesus monkey, which is going to be more similar, they only have about 10 differences. But if we compare human and dog, there's going to be about 30 differences. And then if you go human to bird, there's going to be approximately 45 amino acid differences. And if you go human to an amphibian, like a frog, then there's about 68 differences. Even though this hemoglobin has that same function, these differences have accumulated over time. So going back far enough here to this ancestor here, all of those ancestors, or all of the organisms that came from there, were using this hemoglobin, but little differences accumulating over time have caused these changes. So even this molecular evidence seems to support the idea of this change occurring over time. Based on all of this, we can generate relationships among organisms, and we call these relationships phylogenetic trees. So this is going to be based on tracing the origin of a particular nucleotide changes to reconstruct evolutionary history, and that's really what a phylogenetic tree is. It doesn't have to be with molecules of hemoglobin, but it could be just tracing back evolutionary history using all kinds of molecular and evidence, anatomical evidence, to put these trees together. So now we're going to switch over to unifying themes in biology. These are themes that we'll relate every topic we cover after this to. One is cell theory, and that's that all organisms are composed of cells. We know that cells cannot exist anything less than, or life cannot exist anything lower than a level of organization of self. So cells are considered the basic units of life. And we also know that all cells must come from pre-existing cells. So there must be a cell before to give rise to new cells. And then here we just have pictures of some cell types. These look like marine single-celled organisms called diatoms, and this one down here, I'm not sure what it is. Another theme is that there is a molecular basis for inheritance, and this molecule is a famous one called DNA. And DNA has 4 different types of subunits that make it up, or 4 nucleotides. And those 4 nucleotides are what makes the code. The code is found within those 4 nucleotides, and we'll study that later. And so this is a good time to define what a gene is. So a gene is going to be a discrete unit of information. Sometimes, quite simply said, that the gene codes for a protein. So, for example, there is a gene coding for hemoglobin. So we'll look at that a bit more as we move to later chapters. A genome, another term that's important to know, is an entire set of DNA instructions for an organism. So we might say, what is the human genome, or what is the frog genome? Oops, let me go back there. So in order for us to continue with a species, or a species to continue to produce the next generation, that's going to depend on the true copying of this DNA into the new cells from older cells. So there is a mechanism for that, and that's another topic we're going to study later on, how DNA copies itself. Another theme is that structure fits function. Okay? So when we study structures, we also learn the function. So basically, the function of a structure can be explained by a structure. And so if we know functions from organisms, if we know a function, then we can look for that structure in other organisms, and then it'll give us a clue on what that might be. And this also includes even at the molecular level, for molecules, something as simple as molecules. Knowing their structure and how those molecules behave can give us clues. And so here's an example right here. So a receptor on a human cell for insulin, if we know that, what that receptor looks and how it behaves. And these receptors, if you have a cell, and this is a cell membrane that I just drew here, these receptors would be located on the surface. It'd be little special molecules that are capable of receiving an insulin. So when insulin is floating around your blood and gets to the right tissues and ends up finding the right molecule. And so those two molecules interact. They are specific for each other. It's kind of like if you have a key and you just go randomly put keys in doors, and eventually you find the right lock. That's kind of how these receptors work. So if we find a similar receptor like that in a worm, then we might conclude that this molecule's function is similar in the worm. And then we can go test that idea and study it further. So diversity of life is another theme, arises by evolution, which is Darwin's theory. So underlying the unity of biochemistry and genetics argues for the life from the same origin event. So if we look at the molecules and the genes that make up all of life, we find that all of them use the same basic type of genetic instructions. They have the same genetic code. They use DNA, and then the DNA, the coding for making those proteins is similar in all life forms. So that there is kind of evidence for that relationship. If you go back far enough, you find an ancestor for all of the life forms we see today. So this provides an explanation for why we see many different living things today. So it shows us why we have such diversity today. That diversity is due to that change or evolutionary change over time. In order to help study organisms, biologists are going to classify all of the organisms into different groups. The highest groups that we do are called domains, and there are three main domains. There's the bacteria, there's domain archaea, and then there's domain eukarya. These two right here are basically bacteria. They're prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are going to be simple single-celled organisms that don't have a whole lot of complex structures inside. They have no nucleus. You might remember nucleus from earlier biology class you may have taken. Eukarya are going to be all other organisms, and they may be single-celled or multicellular, and these are going to be organisms that have, where their cells have a nucleus and other complex structures within there. This figure shows that you can take that domain eukarya, and we've divided it into, or categorized into 5 different kingdoms. Protista, though, there's a lot of debate and discussion on just whether or not that should be divided into further groups. But we have the kingdom Plantae, the kingdom Fungi, the kingdom Animalia, and the kingdom Protista. So these are the plants, these are the fungus, like mushrooms, and then animals, which we probably can really relate to. Humans that are part of that group. And then the protists, these protists are usually going to be single cell or simple multicellular organisms. But for the most part, the plants, fungi, and animals are all usually going to be multicellular, which means they have 2 or more cell types, whereas the protista here are going to be mostly unicellular. But some are going to be cellular, but some are going to be simple. Topic of the idea of evolutionary conservation, and so we know that the oldest life forms, as shown in the fossil record, are found in rocks that are 3.5 billion years ago. And so before that, we don't see any life in the fossil records. Rocks that are older than about 3.5 billion years, you don't see life forms. So the simplest life forms we do see are in the form of bacteria. So we do. This does suggest that all life must have descended from or come from those earliest life forms, because you don't see woolly mammoths in the fossil record back then. You don't see dinosaurs back then. You see simple single-celled organisms. Whether that being the case, we do see that some other characteristics are preserved regardless. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the use of DNA. All life on this planet that has descended from the earliest life forms uses that DNA as instructions for building an organism. So the idea here is that conservation, if structures like DNA are conserved or we continue to see them today, this reflects that they must have had a very fundamental role in life on this planet. Cells are going to be informed processing systems, information processing systems. So information in DNA is going to be used to direct synthesis of cellular components. So that's information. There's information in DNA. And so if we can control this, the way this information is used within a cell, we call that gene expression. Okay? We can control that. That can lead to the formation of different cell types and different tissues, especially within multicellular organism. Cells also, whether they're part of your body, your multicellular organism, or even single-cell organisms, they're capable of picking up information from the environment, and they respond to that in certain ways. For example, cells in your body can respond to glucose levels, sugar levels, blood sugar levels, or to hormones. Bacteria can sense signal molecules given off by neighboring bacteria, or they can sense food and move towards that. So organisms are constantly processing information from their environment. And within bodies like yourself or a giant tree or any multicellular organism, multicellular organisms, they have to coordinate their activities. So the signaling can go on between those cells in order to coordinate their activities to help to help keep a balance and to keep that multicellular organism alive. All life forms are in a non-equilibrium state. Living systems are open systems, so the living systems are constantly having to take energy in. Without that constant supply of energy, living molecules would begin to break apart. They just wouldn't be able to stay together. It's just not the normal thing. So there constantly has to be a feeding of energy, and this is true for the entire planet, the entire biosphere. It's constantly getting energy from our nearest star, which is the sun. Living things do have these self-organizing properties at different levels, even at the molecular level. Say within cells, structures within cells organize. Individual bacteria, insects within populations, there's a certain organization within those populations. So there's this, at every level, there's this self-organizing properties to it. And I mentioned this earlier regarding emergent properties. Emergent properties are basically, if you look at a lower level of organization like molecules and then you move to cells. If you look at the cells and you were to try to determine how that cell behaved just by studying the lower level of molecules, it becomes difficult. You couldn't predict how the cells, the characteristics of those cells based on just trying to add up what you know about molecules. So that's what emergent properties are. I think early on I used the idea of even a simple example with sodium and chlorine. And sodium is dangerous and toxic, and so is chlorine. But if we put sodium chloride together, that's table salt. So dangerous and dangerous doesn't necessarily equal something dangerous. So that is an example of an emergent property. We go from basic atoms to a molecule or a compound here, and that compound we were not able to really predict from by just simply adding up what we observed at the level of atoms. So